On behalf of the NDHS and the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society, a warm welcome to all of you joining us in person and virtually. Special thanks to our generous co-sponsors, Briscoe, Ivester, and Basil, Bartco LLP, Cohen and Milstein, Cachette, Petrie, and McCarthy, Leaf, Cabraser, Hyman, and Bernstein, Ogletree Dinkins, Cher Edling, and Wilson Sonsini. Their support and that of our members makes this event and others like it possible. We are also immensely grateful to the Ninth Circuit for hosting us in this beautiful and historic space, and for the tireless efforts of the Ninth Circuit court staff, especially Bradley Vanderhey and Sam Gerard, to ensure all runs smoothly during court week, no less. We have a stellar panel for tonight's program and a wonderful surprise as well. We are expecting Judge Thelton Henderson, former Chief Judge of the Northern District and longtime civil rights advocate, to be here later this evening. We are grateful for all of you who have joined us tonight. We're looking forward to a wonderful presentation, and just so all of you know, this will be recorded and in about a week's time posted to the NDHS website, and we will send an email out to all attendees so that you will know when it's available for viewing. It's now my great pleasure to introduce NDHS board member Stephanie Beal, who will introduce our three panelists and begin tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Everyone, I'm Steph Beal, and my role today is very limited. I call myself a quasi-moderator to keep our main moderator and additional panelist, Judge Alsup, on the clock, which is a little bit of a role reversal that I'm very much looking forward to tonight. More importantly, I'm looking forward to the discussion we're going to have and some of the interview clips we're going to watch tonight from our esteemed panelists across the board. I believe that none of them need an introduction, so I'm just going to keep the introductions very brief. We first have Judge Alsup, one of our very own Northern District judges since 1999, and he's been a senior judge for the past few years as well. Before that, he spent a couple of stints in substantial time at law firms at the DOJ and working for the Solicitor General. Particularly relevant to today, he was born in and grew up in Mississippi, went to college there, and went on to Harvard Law School. Justice Jackson is currently the presiding justice of the Court of Appeal First Appellate District, Division 5, and was an associate justice for Division 3 prior to that. She came up on our own San Francisco Superior Court and was actually the first African-American woman appointed to that court. She went on to be that court's presiding judge from 2017 to 2019. She received her UC Santa Cruz Slugs degree in politics and her JD from Georgetown. And last but not least for now is U.S. Attorney Izzy Ramsey. He is the 53rd United States Attorney for the Northern District of California, and he took his oath of office in March of 2023. Previously, he was a founding partner of his own law firm in Berkeley, where he worked for 17 years, starting in 2006. He also served as an assistant United States attorney in the Northern District of California. Mr. Ramsey received his JD from Harvard as well, and an MBA from UC Berkeley, and his undergraduate degree also from Harvard. He's also a proud veteran of the United States Air Force. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Judge Alsup to set the stage for our panelists and the video clips in the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Stephanie. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the 68 Act on Housing were the most important legislation passed by Congress in my lifetime. And I'm sure those of you who are in my age bracket will probably say that's true for you as well. This is the 60th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64. It's been 60 years now. Actually, it's been 70 years since the Brown v. Board decision in 1954. But tonight we're here to focus on the 64 Act and the past, the present, and the future. I want to give our panelists, though, before we begin, an opportunity to make an opening statement. And then the format tonight is going to be as follows. We have an hour and a half. About 30 minutes of that will be some clips from a interview that I did of Judge Thelton Henderson about this very subject a month or so ago. And we are surprised and pleasantly that he will be here tonight if the Uber company can get its act together. It's not his fault. So he will be here, but he was at these clips, so he knows he won't be missing what he said himself. Then we will have, after each clip, there are three of them, the longest is the first, we will then have discussion. Then we'll go to the next clip, more discussion, and then finally we will bring it to a close. And then whenever Judge Henderson gets here, he will be part of that discussion. So that is our plan for the evening, and let me turn now to Justice Jackson. Do you have any opening remarks? You don't have to have it. 30 seconds would be enough.
Well, I'm going to do what I did once in one trial, a homicide case. I waived opening, and I just said, I'm ready, Judge. Let's just put the evidence on. No, first I'd like to thank you all for inviting me. I hope to participate with my esteemed panelists. And I hope that we will be able to share our experiences. And yes, I'm very proud to say that I did live through when it was first passed. I was a little girl, and we'll talk about that further and what my family and what we all thought could happen and and our responsibilities. So I hope that I'll be able to convey that to you. And thank you once again for inviting me. How's that for an opening?
That's very good.
Okay.
Thanks for having me as well. It's a true honor to be here and to be able to talk about the Civil Rights Act. I'd say two things why it's of great significance to me personally. One, with our esteemed guest, Judge Henderson, who I've known my whole life and got to swear me in as the new U.S. Attorney. He and my father lived together during law school, so he is someone who I've always known about, and his efforts in the movement have always been at the forefront. We're always at the forefront of our household, so to be here and share the stage with him and to talk about the efforts of that legislation is a particular honor. Secondly, with respect to the Justice Department, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, always likes to say that the Justice Department is the only federal department with an ideal in its name and justice, and at the heart of it really is the protection of civil rights. The Justice Department was founded in 1870 with the 1870 Act, and it was founded with the purpose of addressing violations of civil rights in the South of freed slaves during Reconstruction. So it really is at the heart of what the Justice Department does, and the Act of 1870 combined with the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which helped establish the Civil Rights Division, and the Civil Rights Act of 64 are really foundational legislative documents that underpin everything that the Justice Department does and is at the forefront of our priorities. So it's great to be here to talk about them.
Thank you. I remember Justice Jackson, back when I first became a judge, she tried a case. She was at Oric Harrington then, in my courtroom. And I think Izzy Ramsey's very first trial, I was the judge. And his dad was in the back of the courtroom the whole time, and he was taking notes. And I was thinking, is he taking notes about me or about his son? I couldn't tell. Anyway, he won that case, of course. I want to take you back in time, and just have too many pieces of paper. Here we go. I looked today at, I have a little journal or diary that I kept back then, and here's my entry for July 2nd, 1964. July 2nd, 1964. You can see I copied it. Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law of the land by President Johnson. So it was all in capital letters like a headline. So that was my reaction as a teenager, 18-year-old at the time. But I want to take you back to yet a different date, in 1963. So roll back all those calendar years in your mind and go back to 1963. And actually, I want to just pause for a moment and acknowledge someone here, Harriet Hutchinson. Could you raise your hand, Harriet? Or there we go. Harriet Hutchinson, who I met today, I knew her son Daniel, who's at Leaf Cabraser. Harriet Hutchinson was in Mississippi in the Selma March in '65, and in Mississippi teaching young kids in the summer of '65. She did a very dangerous thing, and she is one of the heroes that we celebrate today by remembering the '64 Act. So, Harriet. The date that I want you to go back to in '63 is June 11. On that day in Alabama, Vivian Malone and James Hood, two blacks, integrated the University of Alabama. It was a kind of a staged performance where Katzenbach escorted these two to be registered, and the Governor Wallace, purported to stand in the courthouse door, make his speech, and then step aside. It went peacefully. No violence, as had occurred at Ole Miss in my home state in 1962, a year earlier. In fact, it hadn't even been but a few months. So on June 11th, it was, in a way, a happy day. No violence. And President Kennedy decided that very day to go on national television and to do what? To announce that he was going to send to Congress the Civil Rights Bill that eventually became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was an 11-minute speech. It was inspiring, and he said he was going to send this bill up to Congress and call for its enactment pronto, which he did. Now, it turned out to be a major undertaking because bills like that had to meet the resistance of the Southern senators, who in those days had enough votes for filibuster, and they would filibuster the bill to death. Well, we're going to come to that in a moment, but on June 11th, he gave that speech in the evening on national television. That very evening, June 11th, 1963, a third thing happened, which was terrible. The first two were not terrible. And the terrible thing that happened was that Medgar Evers was assassinated in his front yard. Medgar Evers was the field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was very active in Jackson, my hometown, in organizing the boycotts and of the downtown merchants. And he was killed that night after coming home from the office where he watched the president's speech. So June 11th was an important day in the history of the civil rights movement. There was the University of Alabama, there was the president's speech, and then there was the awful murder of Medgar Evers. That is by way of a introduction to what you're now going to see is a presentation of a interview between me and Thelton Henderson. And I apologize, I have this Southern accent, and sometimes too slow, but Thelton Henderson has the greatest radio voice ever, and he makes this work. So can we now play and play it loudly if we can.
All right, so then we wake up the next morning to the terrible news about med grabbers. Tell us what your memories about that.
Well, I remember hearing about it. At this point, as I said, I was in Washington, and I had been with Medgar, I think, no more than a week before. I spent in Jackson, Mississippi, working on some voting rights matters of my own there. So I was stunned by it. I was a huge admirer of Medgar's and his family. I'd been to their house several times, and he was a hero of mine, and I was just stunned when I read that. And of course, I knew what was going to happen because every time there was something like that in the South, they would fly me back. When the 14th Street Baptist Church was bombed, I had to fly back to Birmingham, and that's what happened here. They flew me back to Jackson, and I spent the next week or so there through Medgar's funeral, talking to people and assessing the Black community response to it and trying to get a sense. The office of president was always interested in how volatile these situations were and how likely they were to erupt into violence and just, gunfire and people getting killed. And one of my jobs was to give him as accurate an assessment as I could of those matters.
And that leads to the story many of our listeners will have heard, but others will not have, and that's after the funeral, the Black, not students, but residents were up in arms, or were not in arms, but mad. And they were going to march down to the Capitol or City Hall, and you and John Doerr saved the day from what would have been a bloodbath, like what happened at Selma.
Yeah.
Tell us about that one more time.
Okay, but to correct it a bit, John Doerr saved the day. I was on the other end. I was walking back from the funeral with the Black crowd from the funeral. John Doerr wasn't in that crowd. He is already ahead, and he was over where the police were standing to block our way and stop the procession. So I was far from a hero, in fact, because Medgar had told me several times that one of the things that the police do in Jackson is fire a warning shot to Blacks at waist level, he would say. And I noted that, and I found myself walking at the head of this crowd, and when we came upon the police, I immediately remembered that they fire warning shots at waist level, and I was the coward there. I was sort of worming my way back into the crowd because I knew there was going to be a confrontation. And lo and behold, as I'm doing that, I hear this voice from the other end. John Doerr steps out into the middle of the street and says, "Stop. My name is John Doerr." To the crowd, he's shouting it. And he had the habit of spelling his name, D-O-A-R, and we always ribbed him about that, spelling his name at that moment. And everyone who knows me here knows I stand for what's right. And he gave this speech and calmed everyone down. Everybody who knew him said, "Oh, that's John Doerr," and he had great credibility in the Black community. And he stopped what would have been a slaughter. I'm sure of that. I have no doubt that there would have been gunfire, that there would have been charging of the police. And
but you were right there. You heard every word.
I heard every word. I was right there when it all happened. I saw it calm down. I was with John a little later on when President Kennedy called him, because this was on TV, called him to congratulate him for what he did and how the bravery of it all.
And you have on your wall New York Times story from that week, June 17, 1963, and your name's mentioned in it. The head is militancy grows in Jackson Drive, and then it describes on the front page of the New York Times just what you've described, and it has you there with equal billing with John Doerr.
They were kind to me there, yes.
Well, you say you slunk back in. You were a hero, Thelton. We all know that. So, well, that was June 11th. And then what did you think the passage chances were for the Civil Rights Bill in the summer of 1963?
I thought fair. I wasn't optimistic about it. And I think it says something about me, because as I was thinking about what I might say here, I think this kind of pessimism runs through me, because years later, I was pessimistic about whether this country was ready to elect a black president. I was predicting that Obama would not be elected because this country isn't ready for it. And so that was in 63, I had that same pessimism about the readiness of our country to do something like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Well, your pessimism, I think, according to the history books, was well-founded. At that point, there had been many efforts made in the 20 years before to pass a Civil Rights Bill.
Right.
And in every case, the Southern senators had blocked it.
Right.
And not to mention the problems in the House, but yet President Kennedy thought he had some chance, else he wouldn't have taken that gamble.
Exactly.
So you got to admire him for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I admire him. And yeah, it was a gutsy thing to do.
I want the people out there to see this nice picture of Thelton Henderson in 1962 and 3. And this was him at the Justice Department, Main Justice, as we call it, in Washington, D.C. It's one of the finest pictures I've seen of you. So I brought my copy of this book so that we could show that. Well, then President Kennedy was assassinated in November.
Right.
And our new president, Lyndon Johnson, came in, and he gave a speech just 3 days or so. It was the Wednesday after the assassination. And he said the best way, just to the joint House and Senate, and the best way we can remember our fallen president would be to enact the Civil Rights Bill that he sent down to Congress. And I did see this for sure. There was an amazing moment where there was a standing ovation in the hall, as if to express a moment of national will.
Yeah.
That by God, we're going to pass this Civil Rights Bill. Do you remember that moment, and did you see that on television? And if so, what was your reaction?
I do remember it, and I thought in the wake of that awful tragedy of Kennedy being assassinated, that who better than Johnson, the consummate politician, the consummate arm twister, the consummate Southerner. He was a Southerner, and I think that weighed heavily in his ability to send a message to the South that he was going to follow up and see that the bill that President Kennedy wanted passed would, in fact, be passed. He was a powerful figure in that. It was very inspiring. I
thought so, too. And as you say, he was a Southerner, so you'd have plenty of grounds to... All those people from Texas, sometimes they don't count themselves as Southerners.
Right.
They like to think of them as Westerners, but nonetheless, the truth is he had allied himself with Richard Russell and James Eastland, all those Harry Byrd, all those diehard conservative
Right.
house in the South. And here he was now being vigorous. And it turns out that he was serious about it.
He was serious, and that was a pleasant surprise. He was not only serious, I think, and this is just a guess on my part, that he saw this as he wanted this to be his legacy. I think this was, and indeed in a way it is, although it is rightly attributed to Kennedy as starting it, but he carried it on and he brought it to fruition.
And in fact, not only the Civil Rights Bill in 64, but the Voting Rights Bill in 65, and then the Fair Housing Act in
68. Right.
So he was, I think he was, you're right, don't use that, that was his legacy.
Yeah.
And he got something through Congress that most people would have said had no chance.
Exactly. He was the consummate politician, you know.
Do you remember that period? First it got through the House. It was not easy because you had to get past the Rules Committee.
Right.
But finally it got past the House and it was in the Senate. And then the filibuster started.
Yeah.
I think it's the longest filibuster in Senate history.
I think 75 days is
something like that.
Yeah.
Very long. And it needed 2/3 for what's called cloture.
Right.
And there wasn't enough Democrats to, of course, Southern Democrats were doing the filibuster. So the Everett Dirksen, Republican from Illinois, came to the rescue.
Right.
Tell us what you remember about this.
Well, I remember I hadn't thought of Dirksen in any significant way until that, but he did a masterful job of getting the Republican votes in, and I ended up as a great admirer of him. And over the years, I think you couldn't have done it without him. If he had been against it, I think it wouldn't have gotten those votes. So I'm a great admirer of Dirksen, and I don't know anything about his past, but I was surprised that he put the energy and was so successful on it.
He was from a state that's known as the land of Lincoln.
Right.
And it was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. I think that weighed on his conscience.
Probably so.
And so he said something like, this is an idea whose time has come. So he got behind it.
Yeah.
And I think the first pen that President Johnson gave on the signing, first pen went to Everett Dirksen.
It did, yeah.
Martin Luther King got one too.
Right.
But Everett Dirksen got the first pen.
I forget the number, but I think Johnson had something like 60 or 70 pens that he gave to various people.
All right, so then we wake up the next morning to the terrible news about Medgar Evers. Tell us what your memories about that.
Well, I remember hearing about it
All right. Past, present, future, that's the way we've organized this tonight. And we're going to have some comments now from our esteemed panel. I'm okay? Good. And on the past of what we've just, the before and the after. I mean, just think about it for a second. We were in a time when someone like Medgar Evers could be shot down in his front yard. And there were quite a number of people who suffered a fate like that throughout the South, sometimes outside the South, but 90% in the South. And then we had the law passed. So, Justice Jackson, your observations, please.
I was a little girl. I was born and raised here in the Bay Area. In fact, I grew up a little bit in San Francisco, and the majority of my childhood was Daly City, California. And when Medgar Evers died, or was assassinated, I should say, I remember I was probably, I don't even get into it. I was about 4 or 5, And I'm at the dinner table, and my parents were talking about it and how my mother was crying. My father said, there's no place to be safe, and that was in Daly City, and here I am, 4 or 5, listening to this. We had just moved into our home in Daly City in a certain area that was all white. And in fact, some of you have heard this story. My parents had to hire a white couple to portray themselves as my parents, as Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. And they would take the little photographs and the little box photographs, and then they would take it and develop it, and then come over where my parents were living, and when I was a small child, and develop the pictures to show them what the house looked like. We did not see the house physically until the first time we moved in, because the owners did not want to sell to a black family. So when the Civil Rights Act was being discussed, my father and mother had a guarded optimism that this, maybe Portia and Terry, my older sister, would not have to go through what they had to go through just to buy a house in a neighborhood that had a good school to educate their children. And when I say guarded optimism, I remember my dad saying, I called him Daddy, saying, but you can't change people's hearts. And that this was a step, but there has to be many more steps. You discussed the 14th Street Baptist Church. I remember that when it happened, again, as a child. And it happened where 4 little girls in Sunday school, similar to Teri Jackson going to Paradise Missionary Baptist Church on San Jose Avenue for Sunday school. And when that happened, they cleared us out of and here we are in San Francisco. And I remember the devastation, and I remember how I was frightened to go to church because I didn't know if that was going to happen here. And I have a confession. Because of the 14th Street Baptist Church, I never sat near a window at a church, even now. I remember coming in, looking at this beautiful, beautiful courtroom, and if you remember, I sat over on this side of the aisle because of the fear. In fact, I remember the one and only time I sat near windows was when one of my former colleagues, Charlie Crompton, had his investiture at Glide Memorial Church, and that was the first time I sat near a window in a church. So, the 64 Act was the first of many. Medgar Evers to be shot down on his driveway in front of his children. Many of his children, I was the same age. It was frightening times, but optimistic times, but frightening times. So that's what I remember. Oh, and a little aside, when we bought that house in Daly City, we had gone to church, had come home from church, and green paint was all over the front of the house with the N-word. You know what the N-word was. And one of the teenagers, older teenage kid, turned out to be my first bailiff as a Superior Court judge. His younger brother was my bailiff. And as you know, that's your line of defense if something should happen in the courtroom, and I would have to depend upon that person. And I'll never forget Deputy Prey. I can say his name. I've told this story many times. He came into my chambers about 6 months after I was appointed, and he said, I noticed that when you were introduced to me, you had a funny look on your face. And he thought I recognized him or his name. And all I thought, what a strange name. I remember some kids growing up in my neighborhood named Praise. And he said, my older brother was the person who was a part of putting the green paint on your parents' home. And then he said, you have every right to not have me as your bailiff. And I didn't say, well, I've moved on. But I said, for some reason, I'm going to trust you. And we worked together for about 2 years after that. And then he was transferred out and I was transferred. But things come around.
U.S. Attorney Ramsey.
Yeah. Well, I was not born in 1963.
Thank you for reminding me. On that note, I'm going to go sit on that side.
But, it's a year that does have a lot of meaning historically. For me, like I said, my father and Judge Henderson were in law school together at Berkeley, then known as Bolt Hall, and he was the class of 63, and Judge Henderson was the class of 62. And they lived together. And in 1963, he was the only African American in his class at Berkeley, and it would always amaze me that he could tell me which African American he was who graduated in the history of the school. So he was the 13th, and Judge Henderson was the 12th. And during the pandemic, I guess I did something that maybe I shouldn't have done, but while I was going through the process of nomination and being confirmed, and I wasn't able to practice because of my conflicts, I actually drove across the country by myself, and I worked my way to Mississippi and drove through Mississippi and visited, and in Alabama as well, and visited all these civil rights sites, and really was time and time again that 1963 came up, and I was just sort of jotting down, some places right there in Birmingham and Mississippi, but Medgar Evers' house, as you said, in June, but other things that were happening where there was violence. There wasn't in the University of Alabama, and I visited where Governor Wallace stood in the doorway and announced segregation forever, or was it segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation forever? But there were other things that were violent, whether it was on the Grove at University of Mississippi and James Meredith, whether it was Fannie Lou Hamer, in June 9th of 1963, and the police brutality that she later spoke about, where she was stopped in Winona, and then where she was taken into custody and brutalized by the police there. That was June 9th of 63. The Children's Crusade in Birmingham was May 10th, and the violence that was enacted on protesters in Kelly Ingram Park. The Birmingham church bombings that we've talked about, September 15th, and on and on. Later in 1964, the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia. But, that's the reality of the times. Over and over again, the incredible struggle that people had to face, and the violence and sacrificing their lives in Miss Hutchinson. I thank you for what you did in Selma. Again, the picture on my phone for my screensaver is actually a picture of my father in 1965 at Selma. And so that was the context of that time. The draw, I think, that African Americans from all over the country felt to being in that movement, and whether it was talking on soapboxes in Oakland or Berkeley about those issues, or actually the draw to go to those areas to try to participate and help in that movement. And one of the most significant milestones and pieces of legislation, because you have to have legislation ultimately, really was the Civil Rights Act of 64. But that's sort of the context that I always heard about it and learned about it as a kid. And my father, who had been out here practicing law but felt compelled to go to Selma and march, ended up arrested, but still moving forward in the struggle and in the movement.
Yeah.
We should never forget, though, the numbers of lives that were given and lost during that terrible period. It goes back further than 63. It goes back even further than 1959. But it was at a fever pitch in 63, 64, 65. Now, when the act was enacted, very shortly, within a few weeks, in fact, I'm going to say within 1 week, those 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, went missing. and later in the summer, their bodies were found in an earthen dam. They were killed by Klan and in cohort with the sheriff, deputy sheriff in Neshoba County, Mississippi. So this law, when it passed and became the law of the land, it took a while for it to take hold. So let's turn to that for a moment and let the panel tell me their views. Time for the next one? Okay. I stand corrected. Thank you, Stephanie. We're gonna see a shorter segment now of the interview with Judge Henderson, and then we will turn to the question that I was about to ask. Thank you, Stephanie. And is there a way to turn the air conditioner on? No? It's getting pretty warm in here. Anyway, if we can, that'd be great. Let's roll the tape.
Review, maybe not immediately, but in the next few years, what difference, impact did the Civil Rights Act have?
I think it had a huge impact on morale of the black community, minority communities, and it did change a great impact upon discrimination as such. It made an inroad into the Jim Crow laws. It eliminated many of the Jim Crow laws, so the white-onlys, signs came down, no, you could sit at the lunch counter, you could ride at the front of the bus. It changed all of those kind of things having to do with discrimination. And it was a great uplift for the black community. It encouraged them. It also encouraged other groups to get activists. So women, the National Organization of Women, now formed about a year after that as a part of that impetus. Disabled people got active, elderly got active, gay community got more active. It started a drive in that direction that really affected our country much beyond race.
Let's take one example let's take public accommodations. Mm-hmm. And I've read in this book and other places, the story before and after concerning your ability as a black to check into a hotel. Mm-hmm. Tell us the before and the after.
Oh, boy. Okay. The dramatic story, and you might remember this happened when we were at the University of Mississippi with following the book that you wrote. And I wanted my wife, Maria, to see the places I had worked when I was with the Justice Department. So I took her along, and after our appearance in Oxford, we decided
we're going to have you here, but we're going to lower the desk. If someone can help me with that. Is it?
Right here, Judge. Right here, Judge.
Oh, right here. Okay. And was that going to work for you?
Yeah.
Okay, you come on around here. I'll move up to the bench.
How's that, Judge? Can you maybe turn this way, and then you could sort of speak sideways to the mic? That's good.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And let me start by saying Uber is not reliable in getting you on time. But going to visit all the spots in Mississippi and in Alabama. So I went to one of those spots. We drove to this hotel in Alabama. And this was a hotel that in 1963, John Doerr and I were in town, and he called me. I had to stay at the A.G. Gaston Motel because that's the only place blacks could stay. And he was at a white hotel. And he wanted some papers on this voting right case we were working on. And he asked me to bring them to him. So I had on my suit and tie and a briefcase, and I walked into the lobby of the hotel, and I guess I made the mistake of walking in with a briefcase and a suit as if I belonged there. And they all but attacked me and ran me out of the lobby. Get out of here. What do you want? N-word. And I left, and I had to go down the street and call John Doerr to come outside and get the papers that I wanted to deliver to him. And so here I am a number of years later with my wife, and we go into that same hotel I wanted to show her. And who's behind the desk but black employees? Who's in the dining room but blacks eating? And it was just amazing experience for me to just see that. And I saw it throughout the South as I traveled with my wife, who is Mexican, but I was even worried as I went, just on those horror years when I was there with so much racism, how that would be treated, walking down the street with a woman who appeared to be white. But it was a huge change, and it was gratifying to see it. And I visited a lot of people. I've met people there that were, lived a different life than their earlier people had lived in 1963.
That's a good story. You mentioned our visit to Ole Miss. It was quite a contrast. Don't you think we were both treated wonderfully by the people at Ole Miss?
We were. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. And I've told the story many times. As I walked around campus the next day or the earlier in the day of their event, literally there were more blacks walking around the campus of Ole Miss than are walking around the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. There's no doubt that's true.
Yeah, that's also true at my where I went at Mississippi State. That's a very astute observation. And now compare that to 1962, when James Meredith tried to enroll there, and there were terrible riots. Mm-hmm. And one guy was killed. A newspaperman from France was killed. It was awful, acute, and just an awful event. And yet, 6 months later at the University of Alabama, peaceful, the students behaved, even though George Wallace did not. And then fast forward after all these years, you are welcomed as a hero at Ole Miss. So give us another example of how the Civil Rights Act did something good for the country. Let's take the area of employment. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the before and the after on the Civil Rights Act?
Yeah, no, it made a huge difference in employment, the kind of jobs that blacks could get, and also the elimination of barriers to getting those jobs. And one of the things I wanted to touch on that I think relates to your question is that blacks were emboldened. The word was out. And so blacks, just as they were emboldened to try to register to vote, they were emboldened to try to look for jobs, and feel entitled to jobs that previously they wouldn't even try to get. And so the employment went up, and there was a lot of change in the black community in terms of what they were capable of doing. So it was a huge change.
So let's focus now on things that unfinished business, so to speak. The areas in our economy, areas in our national life that the Civil Rights Act has not cured. So let's look. We focused on some of the positives.
Yeah.
Let's focus on some of the unfinished business.
Yeah.
So what's your view on that subject?
Well, I think that the Civil Rights Act of '64 eliminated or led the way to the elimination of Jim Crow laws and laws of discrimination, as I said earlier, whites-only kinds of activities. What it didn't do was work on racism itself. So racism still persisted, and the effects of racism, it didn't work on that. And one critic said that, for example, it was like, without working on the economics of the black community, it was like starting a black in a 50-yard dash 10 yards behind and expecting him to run and compete. It didn't address those problems. And I think those problems, to a large measure, still exist. The really deep embedded problems, so that right now, today, there's twice as much black employment as white unemployment as white unemployment. It didn't address the economic and the poverty of the black community or minority communities. And I think that remains to be solved still. It's a probably deep problem and a more worrisome thing that I see now happening, that I saw starting to happen and I think still exists, is that those who were against the Civil Rights Bill and were critics of it used the failure of the black community to now rise. Okay, no more discrimination, you're just like us. You said that they weren't, and they didn't still have all of the opportunities. And they used that to say, see, it wasn't racism at all. It's the inadequacies of the black community that is holding them back. So that sort of became part of the criticism of the Civil Rights Bill and of the black community. And we went into an era of colorblindness and reverse discrimination. And I see some of the gains then receding a bit with this kind of thing. And Reagan advanced it, and I think Nixon did, so that it led to the move from mass incarceration, which we have now. And one of my biggest cases in the 37 years I was on the bench was dealing with the overcrowding in the California jails and fighting that problem. So I think Martin Luther King often said that the history of the civil rights movement is 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. And I think right now we're maybe taking 2 steps backward because of all of those things that I've mentioned. Again,
wouldn't you? Okay.
All right, Judge Henderson. You go first on follow-up comments and observations. Your turn, please.
Let's see. You want my observations
of the segment that we just listened to and the general topic of before and after the Civil Rights Act and what difference it made in our country?
Okay, well, I think I touched pretty much on it in the interview. It made a huge difference, and we shouldn't make any mistakes about it. And at the time, everyone involved, and I remember Lyndon Johnson saying that this is a magnificent day and the future of our country, it looks brighter as a result of the Civil Rights Act of '64. And it did and it does. But there have been reactions. I guess I'm worried now. I find myself worried today. Much of what's going on, I think, is race-related and is related to people being threatened by the advancement of blacks. And I think that's a big unspoken problem in our country these days. I think that a lot of things that are happening, and race is not being mentioned, but is at the base of many of the political activities that are happening. It's certainly happening in Florida, where Florida doesn't want you to read in the libraries, the school libraries, about our racist history. And it's sad to see. I'm very saddened by that. And King said we're not going to, he famously said that the South will solve the racial problem before the North will. Doesn't ring true with Florida, but because they deal with the problem. Once they do deal with it, it's behind. Whereas in the North, they don't hang up a sign and say, no blacks, we don't rent to blacks. But still, if you go to the wrong place and there's a for rent sign and they see you at the door and you're black, they say, oh, gee, we just rented it. And they deal with it in a different way. So we still have those problems. But the Civil Rights Act of '64 was a huge, huge step forward. And it led to the Voting Rights Act of '65 and the Housing Act of '68, which also changed things in a tremendous way. So I guess that's pretty much a sum up.
Okay. Justice Jackson, your observations.
I agree with Judge Henderson. It is the foundation for the Voting Rights Act in '65, as well as the Housing Act in '68. And you also said it did not eliminate racism, which I've already touched on. The heart. You can't change people's hearts by statutes. It's something that we have to continue to work on and to educate and to make sure people understand when we're talking about inclusion, it's not at the exclusion of others. It's just bringing more people to the table to help solve our issues. You know, I told you the other day about being a little girl. Yes, I was born and raised here, but every summer I would go, my parents would send us to Louisiana to be with our grandparents. And coming from Daly City and going down to Jonesboro Hodge, Louisiana, and that's in the northern part of Louisiana, was a different experience. We had the Voting Rights Act in '64 passed. It did eliminate Jim Crow, but it eliminated it very slowly. I remember as a child going to, with my father, he was. I think he had driven us down to dump us or drop us off with the grandparents. But we went to a cafe as we were driving, and we would stop at these cafes, and there's no air conditioning. We would always be in the kitchen, and people would, being in the kitchen, though, they would just give us more food than we ever ordered. They took care of us when they knew my father was traveling with these two little girls to take them to their grandparents in Louisiana. And one day, I got up and I walked to the door, and it was a big glass door. And on the other side of that glass door, and this is in '67, people were in that cafe. You could feel the air conditioning because you could feel the coolness that was on, and they were all white people. And I remember saying, Daddy, we could sit in there and be comfortable. And although it didn't say whites only, blacks only here in the kitchen, it was understood. And that wasn't just in that particular cafe, but it was throughout Jonesboro Hodge at that time in '67. When my uncle took me to the movie theater out here, when we would go to the movies, we were never allowed to sit in the balcony. You know, things happened up in the balcony. But in Louisiana, that's where all the black people sat. And that went on. So it was the implementation of this, the Civil Rights Act. That was not supposed to happen. But it took a while for it to really take form in reality. And I saw that as a child. And the high school, when they integrated the high school, I won't say the name, and they had the blacks on one side of the high school and the whites on the other side. And so whenever, I guess, Justice Department would say, have you integrated this particular high school? They would say, yeah, the school's integrated. They weren't lying, the school was, but it just was separate. Now, they may have used, well, the black students didn't take the test, they couldn't get into, and then eventually, of course, that was eliminated, but it did take time, and that's about the people's heart. Those are my observations.
General Ramsey.
Not a lot to add, Your Honor, but I would say obviously there has been tremendous progress. I mean, in large part because of the Civil Rights Act and subsequent legislation that has helped change many people's hearts, even to the extent, although in many areas sometimes we have where some individuals have ways to go. As I said earlier, I drove through the South and during the pandemic and drove by myself and drove through Mississippi, and just as we sit here today and we think about public accommodations, obviously I could get on an app and find a place to stay at a moment's notice. I didn't have to worry about a green book or where I was going to stay, let alone the dangers that people faced just for being in particular places at a particular time. So the progress has been extraordinary. I think, with respect to my current job as a U.S. Attorney in 1963, the late Honorable Cecil Poole, who was ultimately a judge on this court at that time, was the first black United States attorney in the country. And today, we have, I think, 16 or 17 African Americans who are serving as U.S. attorneys. So, the progress has been tremendous. But I agree with Judge Henderson talking about still the challenges of equal economic and educational opportunities and the importance of studying our history and having our history be known and the dangers that are presented today where certain portions of the population or certain individuals or state legislatures in some case don't want to discuss the history because it's uncomfortable. But sometimes you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable so that you can move forward and address those issues.
Let me make a comment. I agree that it took about 2 decades to implement the Civil Rights Act, so that if you drove through the South in those days, maybe in '84, you could see dramatic difference and mostly compliance in public accommodations. And I say this from having grown up in Mississippi, and I came out here in '73, but I went back home to visit, and I could observe the differences over time. In the '70s, it would have been unusual, but it did happen, unusual to go into a restaurant and see both black and white patrons. You could see it, and you immediately noticed it. And I remember thinking, those blacks are putting themselves in danger. But gradually the time came whenever that it faded away, that fear that the public would recoil, that someone would try to bring out a gun. that faded away. I'm going to say somewhere around 1980, in the mid-'80s, I felt that that had largely passed and that the act had finally taken hold. Now, obviously, even today, you can go to employers and find discrimination, and you can go to restaurants where maybe they would, or hotels where they would find some excuse not to serve you. Yes, but the act finally did a lot of good in the part of the country that I'm from, and I think also in the rest of the country. I want to disagree a little bit with Justice Jackson on one thing she said, that laws cannot change hearts. I actually think the other way around. I think the Civil Rights Act gradually set a new ethical norm in our country, and that discrimination, which was perfectly legal and permissible before, was now illegal, and gradually good people, and we certainly have some good people in this country, that's, I believe, they adopted the norm, as their norm, in their heart, what the Civil Rights Act had provided for. So that's my view of that issue. I think there are some terrible people who will never change. Yes, that's true. But others, as they grew up in an era where the Civil Rights Statute was the law, I think they incorporated that into their hearts. So I think we have a slight disagreement.
No, that was my father's perception.
I see, okay.
No, I would, if I believed that, I wouldn't be sitting here, okay? But it was my father's perception, and that to be very guarded and not to take things for granted and think, fold your arms, it's over with. There was more work to be done.
Okay, fair
That's
enough.
where my father was coming from.
Well, and I would have agreed with him on that point, yes.
That's a really good segue to our final.
All right, let's play it. One last question. What advice do you have for America on how to move forward on the issue of race?
That's a tough one, and it's probably as idealistic, but I think we have to realize that we're all in this together, this country, to move forward, especially now. The United States is no longer so far ahead in the world in terms of its standing in the world, its power in the world, as it was back in 1963. And one of the impacts of the racism thing is that, and it's playing a role, I think, in the upcoming election with Biden and what appears to be Trump, is that the white community, the poor rural white community, is up in arms now about their treatment. And they're saying, we need these kinds of things that you're giving blacks. And we need to address the entire problem and not them versus us kind of a thing, but see it as solving the whole problem, because it's not just the blacks who are screaming about equality. There are many whites now who are doing it. And I think it's something that we need to address and join together as a national problem and not a racial problem.
General Ramsey, your turn.
I would, agree going forward. I just would emphasize the sort of importance of studying our history and understanding context and not removing that from the discourse. I think, only by understanding that full context can we fully move forward. But I'm hopeful. As Judge Henderson said early, sometimes it is one step back and two steps forward. And there are these periods where you're not necessarily headed in the direction that you want, but I'm hopeful that collectively people will come together and move forward and address some of the additional areas. And we've seen that even recently in the last 20 areas, and sort of the expansion of rights in LGBTQ areas, transgender, and we need to think about those collectively as human rights, and continue to use the Civil Rights Act and other legislation to make sure that we protect those rights and move things forward. And we're going to have challenges, in new areas, particularly in the digital age, but perhaps we'll talk about that later.
Well, we will. Justice Jackson?
I, too, I guess I have an idealistic perspective. And to me, growing up, voting was the most important thing to do. I remember when I was, I was of age to vote and to register to vote, and I was going to UC Santa Cruz, and my parents called and said, come on home, and I thought they were going to give me my brand new car. And I remember Kevin Filer, who is a judge down in Los Angeles, driving me home. And Kevin, we were talking about what kind of car I'm going to get. And my father and mother said, come with me. And they drove me down to San Mateo County Recorder's Office to register to vote. That was my birthday present. However, that was a very important birthday present, and I have never missed a vote in my life. In 1965, my grandmother, Big Mommy, that was the first time she was able to vote. And that was so when my nieces...
Wait, what year was that?
Huh?
What year did you...
In 65.
65. She's not in California, she's in Louisiana. Louisiana, okay.
That was her right to vote. And even when she moved out here, she would get her absentee ballot to make sure she got it in. Wherever I studied, I was at Georgetown, I studied over at Oxford for a while, I always had my absentee ballot to vote. I have two nieces, one's 15. When she turns 18, Tia Terry is taking her in to register to vote. And I hope she will continue that sacred right, because that is how you bring people together. That's how you make change. And that is not my problem, but it's all our problems.
Judge Henderson, weren't you born in Louisiana?
Shreveport, yes.
So we have a Louisiana thing tonight. Your comments, please.
Well, as I think about it, and as I think of the words I said in the interview with you, we have made enormous strides. I have my two best friends are Troy Duster, a distinguished sociologist at the University of California, and Russ Ellis, also a distinguished sociologist and vice provost at the university. And we've known each other over 60 years. And we get together now as we age a lot, and we look to the past. And one of the things we say first is, gee, I'm 90 now, Troy is 89, and Russ is 88. And we say, we're not even supposed to be here because we met 65 years ago, and the life expectancy of a black male back then was something like 67 years old, and here we're in our 80s and 90s. But when we talk further, we'd say back when we first met, we weren't supposed to be a federal judge. We weren't supposed to be the head of the sociology department at one of the finest universities. But and that gives you a perspective. There have been enormous strides. As Izzy, I hope I can call you that here before this crowd, Ramsey said, I replaced Cecil Poole, who was the first U.S. attorney on the bench. I was the second black. Now we've had a number. There was one at a time when it first started off, and now it's been a while, but we have several blacks on the court, and we've had a string of them, and there will always be a black on the court now. I was also one of the earliest in the country, and now we have a group where the black federal judges meet around the country, and it's more than a room full, it's a building full of them now. The advancements are huge and humongous, and I think at one level there are opportunities that are almost equal opportunities for blacks and for minorities. But the thing I see as I get in touch with my family, most of them are down in LA where I grew up, they live a different life than I do, and I'm sort of a stranger to them in an interesting way. I'm the rich relative as in their eyes. I'm the successful one. And I go down there and I will say something about voting. And many of them, they don't believe it. They don't even vote. Vote doesn't matter. That doesn't matter for us. We need jobs. We need something to pay the rent. And it's that part of the society that we need to look at more than whatever level I am. I don't need any help. We don't need any help up here, but there's still a level that we need to reach down at and focus on and make special attention to. And one of the unfortunate things I've seen over the years is when we do that, and the reason it's happened is that they've been denied the education and they no longer expect it. They're not even trying any longer. And we need to go down there and show them that there's a place here for them. And that's what I would like to see happen. And without saying, oh, they're on welfare, this money is going to welfare queens, and this kind of negative thing, and really look at the problem in a humanistic, socialistic, sociology, not socialist, but a humanistic way, and deal with those problems. I think we have the means to do it. What we need is the will to do it, and I hope that comes.
I think we wanted to save 10 minutes for questions, and we have about 11 minutes. So let me pause here. And what is our procedure for questions? Just stand up, and then I'll repeat what the question is. Okay, raise your hand if you. Is that Ray? Please, Ray, your turn. When you say the court, you mean the Supreme Court, or do you mean us, the federal court?
I would say federal courts, even not just the Supreme Court. There are courts in other states, other jurisdictions, other circuits.
Well, let's include the California Court of Appeal.
He's bringing. I can start. You know, you're right. Oh, could you?
All right, well, it was a long one. That was a speech plus a question. But it comes down to this. What can the courts do or should do to reassure the black population that the courts are still in their corner at least whenever the law is and the facts are in their corner? I think that's what you're asking, and you're suggesting that recent decisions have drawn into question whether or not the federal judiciary is what it used to be. All right, I think that's the question.
Right, and we're going to also include the state court because I'm on the Court of Appeal. I would go one step further, just reassure everyone that our courts are there to follow the law and administer it fairly, and that everyone has equal access. In California, and I'm not commenting on the legislation by any means, but there is recently there is the Racial Justice Act that has been passed in California, where courts have to make sure that there's no explicit or implicit bias for any person in the criminal courts. And it deals with not just the judges, not just the prosecutor, but also the defendant's attorneys and everyone who is affiliated with the courts. So there is a recognition that is taking place. And those cases are now, all cases are being reviewed, I should say, or a good many of them are being reviewed for that purpose, to ensure that everyone who appeared in that courtroom received a fair trial and that he or she was not treated or bias was not inflicted upon them. We also have our courts in California, and I'm glad one of my colleagues is here now, Michael Beckert, Judge Michael Beckert, care courts. So we're looking at not incarcerating, but trying to deal with the treatment and the reasons why people might be on the streets or why there should be a conservatorship. And of course, you know that better than I do. So I hope I'm kind of describing the care courts. So there is a recognition, and there is a drive in California state courts. I'm not saying the federal courts are not doing that, but there's legislation that's there in our courtrooms to deal with that issue. Also, we have legislation that we as judges have to take into consideration. If a person has committed a criminal offense and he is 20 or he or she is under 26 or younger, those factors should be taken into consideration. In our civil courts, we are trying to make it more accessible by self-help, so people who cannot afford attorneys can at least be guided through the system if they have a wrong that they wish to address. So those are the things that we in the state courts, I can't talk about what's going on in the federal courts, but what we are trying to do to make sure people feel when they come into the courtroom that they're going to be treated with dignity. They may not win, but their case will be handled fairly. And so those are the things that I'm very happy about what's going on in our state courts. And I might add, in California, when we look at the numbers of our judicial officers, when I started, it was 72% white males over the age of 50. Now California has, where are we now, 40% women in our judiciary, and then I'm going to have the stats wrong, but it is improving. So when people come in the court, they're going to see someone who looks like them. We're not going to rule it because we all look alike, but there is at least they are feeling that we're reflecting our California citizens. So that's what I can say about the state courts. Now, you all are on your own for the federal.
Let me, we have made, on the federal side, a pretty strong effort. I was the head of our jury committee for about 10 years, and one of the problems we've had for a long time, and still do to an extent, is that the juries are not representative of the percentages of the population. And the African American percentage is the worst. And so we said, well, what can we do to fix this? Well, we were doing a few things wrong. I'll give you one example. I called in, he's now deceased, but the minister of one of the churches in Oakland, if you gave me his name, I would remember it, But he said, well, how are you doing the summons? And how do people sign up for jury service? Anyway, we said, well, you go online. As we're modern, we're going online now. He said, well, that's the problem. He said, you African-American, take a guy. He has a cell phone, but he does not have a desk computer. And right off the bat, you are eliminating a huge number of people. So we changed it. You can sign up on your cell phone, and that helps some. That number helps some. We also had instituted follow-up procedures so that when a returned summons came back, I know this sounds boring, but it's important. A return came back, regardless of the race, we would send another one in that same zip code. And the idea was that the returns were, in truth, more reflective of the African American community. So by sending out some more, we might find someone who was actually still living at that address. That was the problem. They were no longer living at that address. So we did that. Another thing that we did is I personally went out to I think it's the BB Memorial Church in Oakland on Broadway, and the minister allowed me, as a completely black church, I felt right at home, and I said, I said, I want to talk about the importance of jury service. So I explained the problem. I got a great reception. There were about 3 times as many people in that as here today, and we have a good turnout. We have tried hard, Ray, to go back to your question. We have recognized that the composition of the jury is just one piece of it. But that, I'm trying to tell you that your federal court has worked hard and continues to work hard. The most recent thing we have for about 4 or 5 years is a video that every juror sees in the jury assembly room that goes into the whole problem of implicit bias. So every single member of the jury sees that before they come in to be questioned for voir dire. So that's all right. Now, what else can we do? Well, we need to be, and I hope on an individual judge-by-judge basis, we need to be fair, and that we want to make sure that the people on the receiving end of our rulings see us as being fair. And that is important, that the public, every race included, sees us as being fair, but especially African Americans, because as somebody pointed out, African Americans have traditionally looked to the courts for redress. So we have to make sure that we are being fair, and that's an individual judge by judge responsibility. I don't know. I could go on. I'm just kind of, but I've tried to identify things that we are doing, Ray, to be mindful of that responsibility. And you are right. The law school that you mentioned had a long history with the Supreme Court and all that important litigation in the 30s and the 40s, and that led to the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, and all of that was federal court, and at a time when very few other courts would even listen to the African American community. All right, enough. Thelton, you get the last word, and then I think we are right at time to stop.
Okay, well, I'll just expand on what you were just saying, Bill. I had a life-changing experience in the first year of my judgeship. I took the bench in 1980, and we have a judge's lunchroom on the second floor, and the judges meet there. And one of the, as I said, I was the only black on the court at that time, after Cecil Poole had moved up to the Ninth Circuit. And one of the judges had a big discrimination case. And in those days, I think most of the judges ate in the lunchroom. They don't eat as regularly there now. But he would come in and talk about this big case. And after about 4 days, he came in and from the courtroom and said, "Boy, it was an interesting day today. The black plaintiffs testified, and it really got interesting." "Oh, what happened?" "Well, they were saying that all the things that happen in the locker room when they go into dress to go out and work, that the white workers were hanging baboons in front of their locker, and they were printing the N-word on their locker." And I perked up and started listening. And this is a guy who's been my friend all these years. He recently passed away, but very nice man. But he said, "I don't understand why they have to lie like that. People don't do things like that." And I said, "Are you kidding? I heard my father and my uncles tell those stories over the years. That is a real experience for blacks." And the point I wanted to make, I learned that judges bring to the bench what they have. And he's a nice man, well-meaning, fair. That wasn't an experience he had. He had a very different experience from me. And so I bring that experience to the court, and it's one of the reasons I've argued over the years for diversity, which has been you have to have judges who've had something other than a private school, Ivy League education, or a rich man's education, or an upper middle class. You have to bring that. And you also, as Judge Alsup said, you really need to judges are seen, I think, as cold, distant people up there banging a gavel and ruling and saying order in the court. And I think you have to bring compassion and let people know you're really listening. You're really listening. You're hearing what they say, rather than saying you win, you lose. And they will believe it. And I've done that a number of times. And I was surprised early on. I would bring that in my rulings. And what I found was that very often somebody just wants a day in court and have a day in court and feel that they're fair. And even when they lose, I've had people come up or write me afterwards after I've ruled against them and thank me for the trial and a fair trial because they've gotten it off their chest, they've had their day in court, and they're ready to move on. And I think that's very important for people to feel about the court.
Judge Henderson, thank you. We have now run out of time. May I bring it to an end, or is there a further speech? Yes, right down the hall and to the left. A beautiful reception is awaiting us all, and we'll see you there. The meeting is now adjourned. Thank you. Get a picture of all of us?